From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now here's your moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
On today's program, we're so pleased to be able to say to all of our friends and the residents of Post Falls, congratulations. This has been the centennial year for Post Falls, Idaho, and for our viewers who come to us today from other states, I hope you'll stay with us to learn about this very rich and fascinating 100 years of that city, which is located just west of Coeur d'Alene and east of Spokane, Washington. Post Falls was founded in 1891, and of course, this being 1991, it is the centennial year. And I'm so pleased to welcome to the program two guests today that will join in that celebration, telling you about that rich history that I have already identified. First of all, I'd like to welcome to the program Mr. Don Camps. He is the former mayor of Post Falls. He came to that town at the age of 4 and has a very, very long history that he can share with us. Mr. Camps, welcome to the program. And I'm also pleased to invite and welcome to the program Kimberly Rice Brown, who is the manager of the Post Falls, Idaho Chamber of Commerce, and she's also the immediate past president of the Post Falls, Idaho Historical Society. Welcome to the program, Ms. Brown. I want to start out with some questions about how Post Falls came into being, and I think I shall start with you, Kimberly, if I may call you that. Can you go back and tell us that there's a name that emerges immediately, of course, and that is Frederick Post, and how he came and settled. If you just start that story, and then when you get that to a certain point, bring in Andrew Celtes and tell us how those two personalities became very, very important in that early history.
All right. Frederick Post was a German immigrant to the United States. He arrived early on in 1851, settling in Illinois, and then later on in 1871 he came to the Post Falls, Rathdrum, Spokane area. Most of those communities were not full-fledged at that time, and certainly Post Falls was not. There was an Indian village there called Camelin, and that was one of the smaller villages of the Coeur d'Alene Indians. It was there that Moses Celtes, actually, the father of Andrew Celtes, who was the head chief of the Coeur d'Alenes, he lived in that area. Andrew Celtes, Chief Andrew Celtes, was the head chief of the Coeur d'Alene Indians, and he actually lived over in this area, in the Spokane Valley near Salties Lake. And it was there that he raised a substantial number of horses and cattle and was a very wealthy chief of the Coeur d'Alene Indians. At any rate, there is a rock in Post Falls that is called Treaty Rock. And on that rock are some petroglyphs, which are rock carvings. And the date, June 1st, 1871, is carved there with the name of Frederick Post. And then also on the rock are some pictographs or rock paintings. And so that particular archaeological site has led many folks to believe that there was a treaty signed there in 1871. Historically, that can't be proved a great deal. There are references made to the date in the 1891 treaty, which was ratified by the Coeur d'Alene Indians and the U.S. government. But at any rate, by the time the treaty was ratified, Post Falls in 1891, and this was shortly 1 year after the state had entered into the Union, Post Falls became incorporated in 1891. So actually, we're celebrating the dates of incorporation, and that is the centennial celebration this year.
And last year was a centennial for the state of Idaho, so it's just 1 year's difference. So you had 2 years celebration in the sense that you participated in the Idaho celebration. Mr. Camps, would you share with us some of the early history of the days when you first came to Post Falls and compare that time and life there with how it is today?
Well, I think one of the first things that I remember about Post Falls was playing in the rocks with another 4-year-old child, and I saw these Indian, these painted men on the writing on the rocks, and I asked my little friend, I said, "My gosh, what's all that?" And he said, "Oh, it's just some old Indian writing," he said. with that terminated that conversation. So, but it was very impressive, much more so then than it is now, because it has faded out and been vandalized so many times that it isn't what it was. Well, of course, I didn't know Mr. Post. He was before my time. But he was a fine old, well-educated old German gentleman. I think his grandson, who was a good friend of mine, told me that he was an officer in the German army and well-educated. And I think he passed away in about 1911. I don't know.
What was during that early period? What brought people in there? I know that first of all, the Post Falls area was part of the land of the tribe until the agreement with the U.S. government, and then, as you said, it became incorporated. But as Mr. Post came in and the tribe decided to move their headquarters to another part of Idaho, what drew people into the Post Falls area, and what was the early industry?
Well, I think the industry it was the industrial activities of Mr. Post who probably brought most people in, the sawmill, and I believe he had a flour mill, and there were other enterprises there that came and went, such as sash and door mills and things of that nature. I think that was mainly it. There's, of course, the farming. I think that came a little later than when people started to develop the land for agricultural purposes.
Mm-hmm. But when you talk about the kinds of industry that came, the fact for our viewers who've never been to the Post Falls, they are the falls there themselves. You know, as you're coming out of Coeur d'Alene Lake and the river that comes through. Did they locate there too partially because of the importance of the water in the falls?
You mean the people
who settled in the Post?
There. Well, I think they did, yes. They must have seen some possibility of real development in the future. Mm-hmm. And, well, there just was a lot of activity there at the time. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask our camera person, if she will, to get on the photographs. We have 4 photographs that we wish to show, and I invite both of you to discuss these, and I think that will give our viewers some idea of the early history and the kind of things that were happening. The first photograph that's going to come up on the screen, I believe, is entitled The Idaho Lumber and Manufacturing Company at 1900. Would you describe to us what this was and how it impacted or continued to impact the city?
Well, I'm sure that's the old sawmill that Mr. Post built, and that was gone when we came here in 1920. So I couldn't tell you very much about that. The later sawmill, I knew it. Mm-hmm. You know,
Kimberly, would you like to add in here too? I noticed there's a lot of use of water there, and is that another reason why the water supply was important?
The water absolutely was a real prime reason, and of course the falls would be a prime reason for Frederick Post relocating here. Certainly the water power, this was before electricity, so water power was absolutely essential for the lumber production, which Frederick Post did begin. Frederick Post was a very important man of the area because he had the equipment for a lumber mill or a sawmill. Mm-hmm. He also had the equipment for a flour mill. And of course the father of Spokane, James Glover, encouraged Frederick Post to first settle in Spokane and develop the area's first flour mill. So for that reason, and of course Frederick Post left his name in Spokane in the Post edition, Post Street. His name is found in Rathdrum, Idaho also.
So he really
and of course in Post Falls. He was a man that certainly realized the potential of water and utilized the power for development.
The second photograph that we're going to show is, I believe, employees of the Post Falls Lumber and Manufacturing Company that was there about 1905, 1919. If you could, either one of you, give us some description of this particular photograph.
This was one old photograph. Actually, we had a lady from Illinois. Her name was Evelyn Shayer. She supplied this photograph to the Historical Society. And one of her relatives, a fellow by the name of Doc Bayer, actually apparently managed the lumber mill for a while. And her father also worked here. But as Don mentioned, the lumber mill, after Frederick Post sold it, went through a series of ownerships, and in some cases, I think it was in 1904, was destroyed by fire. The thing I think that is very important, it went through a series of ownerships, but even at present day, the present site is still maintained as a very dominant lumber mill in the name of Louisiana Pacific Corporation. And so for it being an existing landmark in Post Falls, it's still maintained in its original use.
We're going to go to another photograph, and this third one's going to be the Post Falls washing and water powerhouse, and that again has had an important history when electricity and all came in for that city, and for a number of years now has influenced it too. If you could describe this for us. Go ahead, Don.
Oh, well, I've been all through that, and it's really quite an edifice, though, and the machinery inside, the turbines and all the electrical panels, things of that nature that are in there, it kind of astounds you to think that they've been there for so many years, that they were built all the way back in the early 1900s, and yet they look quite modern. It's an impressive deal.
How important has that been in generating energy? What kind of capacity is involved?
I couldn't tell you about the capacity. As far as the importance is concerned, it was important enough to the Washington Water Power and to the people who were concerned with the First World War. They had a lot of guards around the plant stationed to protect it against sabotage. That sort of thing was very, very, very closely guarded and watched. So evidently it was of very great importance to this area. And
it's continued to be until today.
Yeah.
We're going to show a fourth and final photograph in our celebration of the 100 years, and this is the wooden irrigation flume in 1920, I believe, also known as the Corbin Ditch. If you could describe that for us, what it was and what its purpose was.
Yeah, that used to took the water from, let's see, it started about where the short bridge that goes over to the island where the Washington Water Power is. It started there, and I think it was all gouged out of the earth up to for about 300 feet, and then it joined the flume. And gosh, there were a lot of. I do remember there were a lot of good fish in there. I used to catch a lot of bass. But it finally, it's lost its use when they developed other, I don't remember now why it went into disuse, but it was quite a long flume. I don't know, it must have been about a mile of wooden flume.
Mm-hmm. Some modern technology always takes over, doesn't it, those kind of things.
Yeah, I used to swim in there too. It was a lot of fun, really, because it was quite fast.
So it was not only served some very important purposes for the community, but you could also have recreation, even fish were there.
Well, yeah, for my purpose, the recreation part of it was most important.
Yes. Kimberly, if we could return to you, lots happened in Post Falls from 1891 to 1991, and today we see in statistics that Post Falls is one of the fastest growing communities in the state of Idaho, and it's sandwiched in between Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls. That whole corridor is really growing, and someday it may be one just urban belt to the whole process. How is that affecting Post Falls, and I'll go back to Don in a minute, and he can compare it with earlier times when life was a slower pace. What is Post Falls like today?
I think Post Falls is kind of coming into its own from an economic perspective. Oftentimes we have been perhaps overshadowed by our neighbors both to the east and the west. I think the unique thing about Post Falls is that we've had some major economic impacts that continue to affect Post Falls. The Post Falls Dam, for instance, provided power to the Silver Valley. We still have transportation links with the Silver Valley. The power, of course, is being utilized by new customers now. So the power is important. Where you had someone like D.C. Corbin, a mining magnate, coming in and utilizing the water power. With the Corbin Ditch, for instance, we have different business enterprises that are coming into Post Falls and utilizing different resources for their own use. But the town itself, one of the reasons that there is so much interest in Post Falls, we do have a special quality of life in our small townness, you might say, being a small town. And a lot of folks may work in either Coeur d'Alene or Spokane, but for some reason they really want to live in the Post Falls area. And I think a lot of that has to do with its small town atmosphere.
A few years ago I had the opportunity and was invited to come to Post Falls to do a futurism study, and one thing that we learned in that from the citizens, it was a really great turnout and great participation. And they talked about at that time, this is about 6 or 7 years ago, of the bedroom concept as a community, and that it was very hard, they said, to do a lot of organizing in a way that a community had more people who worked in the community during the day. But I sense, isn't there some change in that with some of the industry and ultimately in what you're talking about, that there are more people that actually not only live there at night and the weekends, but also work there? I know you still have an awful lot of commuting going on, but hasn't that increased the number of people who are working in the city?
Statistically, it has, and the economic efforts of Jobs Plus have brought in approximately 24 businesses to Kootenai County, and of those relocating to the area, 16 or 17 of them have been in Post Falls, which computes out to approximately 405 new jobs. And in doing that, it not only employs students, homemakers, wives that no longer commute to either other community, but it also has resulted in some substantial employment.
Can we show the difference? I know Don was talking earlier about the early industry. You know, the lumber industry was so important, and the flour mill, and the attaching to the importance of the water and the energy. But could you identify some of these new industries that they're there for other reasons? That you mentioned just now that there's a significant number. Could you, some types of the industry or the recreation that's come in?
Definitely the tourism industry is an important part of Post Falls.
Bob Templin's had a look at that with the development of his center, hasn't he?
Yes. You have his resort convention center certainly has impacted the river. He draws on the river's beauty in order to attract people to come to Post Falls, so that's very, very unique, very important. The Greyhound Park, the factory outlets are two very large developments that are depending on tourism. But at the same time, you have the Riverbend Commerce Park, which has brought in some Cabletron. That particular company, Bombardier, with regard to their western outlet, there's a new Imsumet aluminum recycling facility near Post Falls. The timber industry is still holding its own very, very strongly, not increasing in jobs, but certainly not holding its own, and I think that's very important at this time also, based on even our history with a strong timber base in Post Falls.
Businessman Bob Templin has made you rather famous with a lot of his literature and his speeches, where he's talked about that you are a center. If you go from that center, and what a huge population there is. I think he talks about the largest in the state of Idaho. Would you share with us what he is saying and how that does affect people coming and going through the city?
I kind of liken, in a way, Bob Templin sometimes to Frederick Post in their promotion of the community and their continual. I know Frederick Post worked with bringing people out from Illinois and people of a certain that he had known before, encouraging them to come, relocate, and settle, and set up businesses or to work in his enterprise. Bob Templin publishes almost his own one-man economic development package with information, and does have Post Falls in a very promotional way as the hub of a 35-mile radius with 450,000 people within that marketing area. And for a while it may have looked as though that were just an idle boast, but certainly that has become a reality for Post Falls.
You know, there's a really interesting point here to begin your history 100 years ago, and as you end the first 100 years, to have two individuals, one on each end of that centennial time, that were very energetic and very much promoting that Frederick Post started and caused the real growth, and Bob Temple and others, many others involved, but has really caused the last few years for that to mushroom again.
There are some major impacts in Post Falls, certainly. The Jacklin family, also other interests. I think what's happening is Post Falls is diversifying its economy in a very large way, and that is somewhat probably changed, maybe even from Don's time, and also, of course, Don's father came to Post Falls also to set up business.
Don, would you take a moment to compare life many years ago when we described earlier what the kind of economy was, and now that Kimberly has done it with now? Do a little comparison and contrast for us of how life was and is.
Well, there was very little comparison actually. Of course, they referred to Post Falls. I've heard it referred lately to Post Falls as a sort of a sleepy little community in those days, but it really wasn't. We had some activity and some ambitious men, but you have to be at the right place at the right time, and unfortunately that wasn't the case in those days. In fact, when the Depression came in about 1930, the town took a bit of a blow, and the planing mill was taken out of Post Falls, and all that was left was just a rough lumber mill. And it was owned then by some people by the name of Kirkpatrick. And they had a fleet of trucks that, as fast as they took the lumber, the rough lumber out of the mill, away it went to Spokane, and that's where it was processed, planed, and whatever else they did with it, made molding and so on. So that was a bit of a blow to the town, and other things happened. We had quite an apple industry, fruit industry at that time, and it supported a box factory.
Your family was had a long history with the box factory.
Well, yes, not very long, because unfortunately, a year or so after about 2 years after my father became involved with it and bought it, he passed away, and so it didn't do much after that. It wasn't very successful. But there was a good community spirit in those days that I believe that, I don't know that there's quite that much here and now. They needed one thing I remember is they had two schools, the grade school and the high school, no gym. So the people of Post Falls saw the need of a gym and a hall, and they raised the money themselves by having donut sales and different social events to get the money to build they had no government grants in those days, things like that.
Real change where now, with all the growth you've had in your schools, where you have a lot of levies and debates over whether you're going to tax yourself to do that. It's real contrast, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And then it was a matter of where are we going to have our social centers. And they pitched in and did a very good job. We had a very nice auditorium and gymnasium there. And it was all built by the people with their
real community spirit in those times. I don't think Post Falls is unique in that way, in the sense that today around the country, as we've grown, got larger, things are done a lot different, a lot of times with less involvement of the whole community. Kimberly, if I could come back to you, I would like to ask you to tell us a little bit about, now that you've had the celebration, by the time we're doing this program, it's basically over, and I wish we would have done it so we could invite people to come to your town. I know you had a lot of advertising anyway, but I guess a two-part question. One, how did you celebrate? And secondly, have you done any particular thing that's going to be your contribution, like they did with Idaho Centennial celebration? There's several things that's become permanent or long-lasting out of that celebration.
Well, we had several activities throughout the year, actually. We did travel quite and had our photo display, which was started in the Idaho Centennial, and that's something that the Historical Society wants to continue, the collection of photos, working with our residents of all different ages in order to collect those and get accurate historical text with the photos so everyone can enjoy them. We did have our Centennial picnic in August. We were involved in the celebration of Post Falls Days with a variety of Centennial products and Centennial contests, you might say, that were oftentimes just geared. It seems like every activity this year was a Centennial activity, and it was kind of similar to the Idaho Centennial that way. Everything kind of just had the Centennial name on it throughout the year. The Centennial picnic in the summer was a unique experience because we did initiate a program, a sister city program with Herborn, Germany.
That's where Frederick Post had come from.
Yes.
And so you're going to have that connection in the future, aren't you?
Yes, and we're moving into what I term, it's an associate city status, but we're experiencing global, all kinds of new global relations throughout our society, and this is one way that Post Falls can also tap into that new experience.
I really hear two things coming out of this. One, you've done, as cities would do in this situation, you have really done your homework in history, and for future generations, they will have a better recorded history, not only photographs, but I've got some material here that I could show that's been published during your celebration. And in addition, like you're saying, the tie with your roots in Germany originally and the global experience. So I think that is, you're to be commended for doing all of that. With that, I have to bring our program to a conclusion. I want to thank both of you for being here, and again, let us here on the North Idaho College Public Forum congratulate you for your centennial, how well it went. We hope the next 100 years goes so well. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you'll be with us again next week, and we will discuss an important issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is videotaped live by Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to catch the North Idaho College Public Forum the same time next week on this television station.